Number 15. The overthrown alpha. For most of the 20th century, the default assumption about early human social organization was borrowed directly from studies of chimpanzees. A dominant male at the top. Physical intimidation as the primary mechanism of control. The biggest, most aggressive individual holding power until a stronger challenger took it by force. In 1993, anthropologist Christopher Boehm at the University of Southern California published a paper in Current Anthropology that demolished this assumption. Boehm had spent years compiling ethnographic data from dozens of modern hunter-gatherer societies, from the Hadza of Tanzania to the San of the Kalahari to the Mbuti of the Congolese rainforest to the Inuit of the Arctic. The pattern he found was not hierarchy. It was the systematic, deliberate, and sometimes violent destruction of hierarchy. Boehm called it reverse dominance. The concept was elegant and unsettling. In every society he studied, when any individual began to behave as though they were superior, regardless of whether that superiority was based on strength, intelligence, or hunting ability, the group responded with a graduated sequence of social weapons. First, ridicule. Mocking the individual's achievements, dismissing their contributions, making jokes at their expense loud enough for the entire camp to hear. If the ridicule failed, the group escalated to deliberate exclusion. The aspiring leader was left out of conversations, denied warmth at the fire, passed over when food was distributed. And if exclusion failed, the final sanction arrived: banishment. Expulsion from the group into a landscape where isolation meant death within days or weeks. Boehm expanded his argument in his 1999 book Hierarchy in the Forest, proposing that this was not an absence of power structure. It was a power structure turned upside down, the many dominating the one. The collective operating as a permanent, hair-trigger immune system against tyranny. He argued that this system had functioned for at least 100,000 years, and possibly far longer. That the human brain evolved not to accept authority passively but to resent it actively. That our deepest political instinct is not obedience. It is the fear of being dominated and the willingness to form coalitions to prevent it. The implications reach forward through time like a fracture line, because approximately 10,000 years ago, when agriculture arrived and populations swelled beyond the capacity of face-to-face social enforcement, this ancient immune system failed. It worked when every face was visible. It collapsed when the group grew too large for everyone to watch everyone. Every king, every dictator, every authoritarian regime, in the historical record, rose in the space that collapse created. The reverse dominance hierarchy that kept human ambition in check for hundreds of thousands of years simply could not scale. The system that was supposed to prevent tyrants stopped working the moment civilization began, and it has never been successfully reinstalled. Number 14. The voice between worlds. In 2008, archaeologist Lior Grossman of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was excavating a cave on the bank of the Hilazon River in the western Galilee region of northern Israel, when her team uncovered an oval grave pit cut into the cave floor. Inside were the remains of a woman approximately 45 years old and 1.5 meters tall. She had not been buried alone. Arranged around and on top of her body were 86 tortoiseshells, the wing of a golden eagle, a leopard pelvis, the forearm of a wild boar, a complete human foot that did not belong to her, seashells transported from the Mediterranean coast over 30 kilometers away, fragments of red ochre and chalk. A large stone slab had been placed over the grave to seal it shut. Grossman and her colleague Natalie Monroe at the University of Connecticut published their findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The burial, dating to approximately 12,000 years ago during the Natufian period, was the oldest in the cave. The other graves in the cemetery had been arranged around it. The prehistoric burial ground had literally grown outward from this woman. Their interpretation was significant. The grave goods, the arrangement, the placement, and the unique nature of the objects pointed to a single conclusion. This woman was a shaman, a spiritual intermediary. Someone whose authority came not from physical dominance or hunting prowess, but from a claimed connection to forces that no one else could see, hear, or verify. In 2019, Tuija Kirkkonen at the University of Helsinki led a team that returned to another legendary shamanic burial, the 9,000-year-old grave of a woman discovered in 1934 in Bad Dürrenberg, Germany. Using modern microscopic analysis of burial sediments, they recovered feather fragments, providing the clearest evidence yet of a decorated ceremonial headdress. The woman had been buried in a seated position with a 6-month-old infant. She had worn something elaborate, feathered, and intentionally constructed. She had looked different from everyone else. On purpose. At Çemköyük in southeastern Turkey, archaeologists unearthed a 12,000-year-old burial containing a woman interred beneath a limestone slab alongside an auroch skull. Steve Mithen of the University of Reading and Bill Finlayson of Oxford University both highlighted the potential shamanic role based on the unique burial context. The limestone slab, they suggested, may have been placed to prevent the deceased from returning as a spirit. The community both revered and feared her. The theory is profound in its simplicity. The first permanent leadership role in many human groups was not political, it was spiritual. The shaman did not command armies or distribute meat. The shaman explained suffering, interpreted dreams, named the cause of illness, gave meaning to the silence after a child stopped breathing, and in doing so, accumulated a form of authority that was more durable than any physical advantage could provide. Because you can challenge a person who is stronger than you, you can outwit a person who is smarter. But how do you challenge someone who claims to speak for the dead? How do you argue with a person who says the spirits told her the herd will move east tomorrow? You cannot. And that asymmetry was the foundation of the oldest form of institutional power in human history. The first leaders may not have been the strongest or the wisest. They may have been the ones who understood, before anyone else, that controlling the story of what happens after death is more powerful than controlling anything that happens before it. Number 13. The generous trap. In 1963, anthropologist Marshall Solins at the University of Michigan published an essay titled Poor Man, Rich Man, Big Man, Chief in the journal Comparative Studies in Society and History. It became one of the most cited works in political anthropology. Solins had been studying indigenous societies in Melanesia, the vast island chain stretching across the southwestern Pacific, and what he found there was a leadership system that existed nowhere in Western political theory. The big man. A big man was not born into authority. He did not inherit it from his father. He was not appointed by a council or elected by a majority. He earned his position through a single relentless mechanism. He gave things away. He gave feasts. He gave pigs. He gave shell valuables. He gave so much, so publicly, so consistently, that the entire community found itself locked inside a web of social debts so vast that no one could extract themselves from it. His power was not coercive. He could not punish disobedience. He could not imprison anyone or seize their property. What he could do was call in favors. And when you owe someone everything, when they have fed your family during lean months and provided the pigs for your daughter's marriage ceremony, you listen when they suggest a course of action, not because you have to. Because refusing would mean defaulting on obligations that hold your social world together. The system was beautiful in its elegance, and terrifying in its fragility. Because the big man's authority lasted only as long as his generosity continued. The moment he stopped giving, the moment his rival began giving more, the debts expired. The influence evaporated. There was no office to protect him, no title to cling to, no institution that outlived the individual. In 2016, an extraordinary burial was excavated at Baja in southern Jordan, a late pre-pottery Neolithic bee settlement dating to roughly 7,500 to 6,900 BCE. The grave contained a young adult interred with grave goods traded from hundreds of kilometers away, objects that spoke of accumulated wealth and vast social connections. Researchers from the Free University of Berlin argued the burial provided evidence of corporate pathways to power in the early Neolithic, leadership achieved not through aggression but through the ability to mobilize resources and redistribute them. The theory applied to deep prehistory suggests something uncomfortable about the origins of political power. In a world without banks, without storage that could preserve wealth across seasons, without any mechanism for accumulating material goods indefinitely, the only way to build social capital was to give things to other people. The most powerful person in the group was not the one who had the most, it was the one who had given away the most. But generosity creates debt. And debt creates obligation. An obligation compounded across enough transactions and enough time becomes indistinguishable from control. The big man did not command. He simply made it impossible for anyone to say no. Every modern political donation, every corporate sponsorship, every favor traded in a legislative corridor operates on the same principle. The language has changed. The mechanism has not. Number 12. The mother's blood. For most of the history of archaeology, when researchers found a richly furnished prehistoric grave, they assumed the occupant was male. When they found weapons, they assumed the owner was a warrior. When they found evidence of authority, they assumed it belonged to a man. These assumptions were tested so rarely that they functioned less as hypotheses and more as reflexes. Then the science changed everything. In 2023, a team led by Leonardo Garcia San Juan at the University of Seville published findings in the journal Scientific Reports that overturned one of Iberian archaeology's most entrenched assumptions. They applied amylogenin peptide analysis, a technique that identifies biological sex through protein markers preserved in tooth enamel, to remains from the Montelirio Tholos, a massive Copper-Age tomb at the Valencina de la Concepción complex in southwestern Spain. The tomb dates to approximately 2900 to 2650 BCE. The individual buried in the most prominent position, surrounded by the most elaborate grave goods in the entire structure, including flint daggers, ivory objects, ostrich eggshell beads, amber from the Baltic, and a complete elephant tusk, was female. The other individuals who occupied positions of high status nearby were also female. The men in the tomb held secondary positions. Across the Atlantic, a different kind of evidence told the same story from a different angle. In 2017, Douglas Kennett at Pennsylvania State University led a team that extracted and analyzed ancient DNA from 9 individuals buried in Room 33 of Pueblo Bonito, the largest great house in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Room 33 contained the most elaborate mortuary assemblage in the Chicoan world, over 11,000 turquoise beads, over 300 shell ornaments, objects traded from as far as Central America. All 9 individuals shared mitochondrial DNA. Power had been inherited through the mother's line for over 300 years, spanning approximately 800 to 1130 CE, at the political and ceremonial center of one of North America's most complex pre-Columbian societies. The theory is straightforward and difficult for many to accept. In at least some prehistoric and early historic societies, leadership was not merely open to women. It was structured around them. Matrilineal succession, female ritual authority, and the political centrality of women may have been far more common in deep prehistory than the archaeological record, filtered through centuries of androcentric interpretation, has allowed anyone to recognize. The bones were there all along. The molecular evidence was locked inside their teeth and their DNA, waiting for a science that knew how to ask the right question. And when it finally did, the answer was one that generations of researchers had been standing on top of without ever looking down. Number 11. The War Mask. There is a persistent, comforting narrative about prehistoric humanity. The narrative says that before agriculture, before cities, before civilization as we define it, human beings lived in a state of relative peace. Small bands of foragers cooperating across open landscapes, avoiding conflict because violence was too costly for groups that small. The cemetery at Jebel Sahaba tells a different story. Located on the east bank of the Nile in northern Sudan, the site was first excavated by Fred Wendorf of Southern Methodist University in the 1960s. It contains the remains of 61 individuals dating to approximately 13,000 to 14,000 years ago. In 2021, Isabelle Crèvecoeur at the French National Center for Scientific Research led a comprehensive reanalysis. The results were devastating. Nearly half the individuals showed evidence of violent death. Projectile points embedded in bone. Healed fractures from prior assaults alongside fresh, lethal wounds. Blunt force trauma to skulls. Men, women, and children. This was not a single battle. The pattern of healed and unhealed injuries across the population indicated sustained, repeated, intergenerational violence spanning years or decades. In some early human groups, the most important quality a leader could possess was not wisdom, generosity, or spiritual connection. It was the ability to protect the group from other groups. The war chief. Ethnographic evidence from documented hunter-gatherer societies consistently shows that wartime authority was temporary and situational. Among the Plains Indians of North America, a gifted warrior might be granted decision-making authority during a conflict, but that authority dissolved the moment the threat receded. The war chief stepped forward when blood was in the air, and stepped back when it cleared. There was no standing army, no permanent rank. The role existed only as long as the danger existed. Yet the theory contains a darker current running beneath its surface. Because once violence becomes not occasional but constant, once the threat never fully recedes, the temporary leader never steps down. The war chief who cannot be relieved becomes something else entirely. A warlord, a permanent commander, a ruler. The evidence at Jebel Sahaba suggests that this transition from occasional defense to permanent militarized authority may have begun thousands of years earlier than previously assumed. The cemetery does not reveal who led these people, but it reveals, with terrible clarity, why they needed to be led. And the distance between a war chief who protects the group and a tyrant who exploits it is not a distance measured in philosophy. It is measured in how long the fighting lasts. Number 10. The provider's silence. In the Kalahari Desert of Botswana, when a hunter from the Jew/Hoansi-San people returns to camp carrying a large kill, something remarkable happens. The other members of the band immediately begin insulting the meat. They call it thin. They say it will barely feed anyone. They question whether it was really so difficult to bring down an animal that slow, that old, that obviously sick. The hunter is expected to agree, to diminish his own accomplishment, to insist the kill was nothing special. This practice was documented extensively by anthropologist Richard Lee of the University of Toronto beginning in the 1960s. It is called insulting the meat, and it exists for a single, precisely calibrated purpose: to prevent the best hunter from converting his skill into authority. The theory it illuminates is among the oldest in anthropology. In many early human societies, the most direct path to informal influence was the ability to provide food. The most successful hunter, the individual who most consistently brought back game, accumulated social capital with every kill. People deferred to a good provider. They sought his opinion. They followed his suggestions about when to move camp, which direction to travel, which watering hole to approach. But the practice of insulting the meat reveals something extraordinary about the political sophistication of these societies. They recognized, with a clarity that would impress any modern political theorist, that the ability to feed others is also the ability to control them. That gratitude, left unchecked, becomes dependence. That dependence becomes obedience. And that the distance between a generous provider and a domineering chief is not a bright line, but a gradient so smooth that most people crossing it would never feel the change. The solution was ritualized suppression, not of the hunting itself, which the group desperately needed, but of the social leverage the hunting produced. The best hunter was permitted influence. He was never permitted authority. The moment he began to behave as though his contributions entitled him to command, the insults intensified. And if the insults failed, the escalation moved toward something far more consequential than mockery. This was not egalitarianism as passivity. This was egalitarianism as engineering, a social technology so precisely designed that it allowed a community to extract maximum benefit from its most skilled members while preventing those same members from ever converting that skill into power. The question it forces is uncomfortable. How many modern institutions were designed with this level of sophistication? How many of them even tried? Number 9. The Living Archive. In September 1991, hikers in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy discovered a body emerging from retreating glacial ice. The remains, later named Ötzi, belonged to a man who had died approximately 5,300 years ago. He was between 40 and 50 years old at death. He carried a copper-bladed axe, a longbow, a quiver of arrows, a flint-bladed knife, and a small medical kit containing birch polypore fungus, a natural antiparasitic. He had been murdered, An arrowhead was lodged in his left shoulder. Defensive wounds covered his hands. Otzi has been studied more intensively than perhaps any other prehistoric individual in history, yet one detail is consistently underemphasized: his age. In a world where average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years, Otzi was an elder. He had survived more seasons, more winters, more droughts, more floods, more encounters with predators and rivals than most people in his world would ever experience. The sophistication of his equipment and the range of materials he carried suggested extensive knowledge accumulated over decades. The ninth theory of early human leadership selection centers on the elder, not the strongest or the fastest or the most aggressive, the one who remembered. In pre-literate societies, every piece of critical knowledge, every route to seasonal water, every edible root and every toxic one, every pattern of animal migration, every star that pointed toward shelter, existed nowhere except inside a living human brain. When an elder died, a library burned. Every plant identification, every weather pattern, every memory of what happened the last time the river flooded 20 years ago, vanished with them. Research published in 2011 by Kim Hill at Arizona State University and colleagues, analyzing demographic and behavioral data across multiple hunter-gatherer populations, confirmed that older individuals played outsized roles in group decision-making. The pattern was strongest in domains related to ecological knowledge, conflict resolution, and long-term planning. Skills that improved with age. Skills that required decades of lived experience to accumulate. The authority of the elder was not granted by vote or by force. It was granted by the terrifying mathematical reality that if they died before passing on what they knew, the group might not survive the next drought, the next migration, the next encounter with an unfamiliar plant that looked identical to one that could kill you. In a world without writing, the oldest person in the group was the closest thing to a database. Their value was not sentimental, it was structural. The group that listened to its elders was the group that remembered where the water was when the rains failed. The group that ignored them forgot. And forgetting, in the Pleistocene, was lethal. Number 8. The Pillar Builders. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt arrived at a hilltop in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. He had been directed there by a brief survey conducted decades earlier by University of Chicago and University of Istanbul researchers who had dismissed the site as a medieval cemetery. Schmidt recognized immediately that it was something else entirely. Beneath the surface were massive circular enclosures containing T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing more than 10 tons. The pillars were carved with elaborate reliefs of animals in aggressive postures. Lions baring teeth, foxes coiled in tension, scorpions with raised tails, vultures carrying what appeared to be human heads. The site was approximately 11,600 years old. It had been constructed by hunter-gatherers who had not yet domesticated a single plant or animal. Schmidt described the discovery in terms that colleagues repeated for years. It was, he said, like finding someone had built a 747 in a basement with an X-Acto knife. Hunter-gatherers were not supposed to build monumental architecture. They were not supposed to possess the organizational capacity, the surplus labor, or the coordinated vision required to quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones of this size and complexity. Yet someone organized it. Someone decided which enclosure would be built first. Someone selected the images to be carved. Someone coordinated the labor of hundreds, possibly thousands of individuals who traveled to this site, from settlements scattered across a wide region. Chemical residue analysis published by Oliver Dietrich and colleagues at the German Archaeological Institute in 2012 identified traces of oxalate compounds inside large stone vessels at the site, consistent with the production of a fermented grain beverage. The builders, it appears, were rewarded with beer. However, there is no palace, no throne room, no granary under lock, no burial yet discovered at Göbekli Tepe that suggests a single ruling individual of the kind found at later sites. The enclosures appear to have been used for ritual purposes, then deliberately buried and replaced with new constructions. The theory emerging from Göbekli Tepe is that the earliest organizers of large-scale human projects were not political rulers, they were ritual directors. Individuals whose authority derived not from wealth or force, but from the ability to articulate a shared sacred vision compelling enough to motivate hundreds of strangers to carry 10-ton stones up a hill. The desire to build something holy may have created leadership before leadership created civilization. And the possibility that religion preceded agriculture, that the need to gather for ritual drove the need to grow food rather than the other way around, remains one of the most provocative hypotheses in modern archaeology. Someone stood at the center of those stone circles and told others what to build and why it mattered. That person left no name, no tomb, no written record. Yet the pillars they directed remain standing 600 years later, which is more than most modern leaders can say about anything they have built. Number 7. The Tongue of Fire. In 2017, Daniel Smith and colleagues at University College London published a study in Nature Communications that delivered a finding many anthropologists had suspected, but none had quantified with this precision. The research focused on the Agta, a hunter-gatherer population in the Philippines. Smith's team measured social network centrality, reproductive success, and the perceived value of different skills across the community. The most valued skill was not hunting, it was not tracking, it was not tool-making, or fire management, or combat. It was storytelling. Skilled storytellers were preferred social partners across the community. They occupied more central positions in social networks. They had measurably higher reproductive success. The data was unambiguous. In a society where physical survival depended on tangible skills, the most socially powerful individuals were the ones who controlled narrative. Michelle Scalise-Sugiyama at the University of Oregon published a cross-cultural analysis of storytelling in hunter-gatherer societies in 2014 that explained why. Stories in foraging populations are not entertainment, they are infrastructure. They encode survival-critical information. Which plants are safe? Which animals are dangerous? Where water can be found during drought? What happened to the last group that camped near the river during flood season? Stories also encode social norms. What happens to people who hoard? What happens to people who steal? What happens to people who attempt to dominate others? The person who told the stories was the person who decided what the group believed about its past, its present threats, and its available futures. In a world without writing, without competing media, without any mechanism for independent verification, the storyteller's version was not one perspective among many. It was the only perspective, the only history, the only news, the only law. The implications for prehistoric leadership are staggering. The individual who controlled narrative controlled reality. They did not need physical strength. They did not need spiritual claims. They did not need to be the best hunter or the most generous provider. They simply needed to be the most compelling voice in a world where the spoken word was the only medium that existed. Consider what this means for a species that spent 290,000 years without written records, without libraries, without fact-checking, without archives that could contradict a speaker's account. The storyteller could shape the past. They could decide which events were remembered and which were forgotten. They could elevate allies and diminish rivals through nothing more than the stories they chose to tell and the details they chose to omit. That power did not vanish when writing was invented. It simply moved to a new medium. And if you think the modern world has solved the problem of narrative control, consider how many of your own beliefs were shaped not by evidence you personally verified, but by stories someone else told you first. Number 6. Blood remembers. In 2017, a team of geneticists and archaeologists led by Douglas Kennett at Pennsylvania State University published a study in Nature Communications that changed the conversation about when hereditary leadership first appeared in the Americas. They had extracted ancient DNA from 9 individuals buried in Room 33 of Pueblo Bonito, the largest and most architecturally complex great house in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Room 33 was not an ordinary burial chamber. It contained the most elaborate mortuary assemblage in the entire Chacoan world. Over 11,000 turquoise beads, over 300 shell ornaments, jet and shell pendants, objects imported from trade networks stretching into Central America. These were not common people. These were the elite of one of North America's earliest complex societies. The DNA told a story that no artifact could have revealed. All 9 individuals shared identical mitochondrial DNA. the genetic material inherited exclusively through the maternal line. Power at Pueblo Bonito had been passed from mother to child, generation after generation, for over 300 years. From approximately 800 CE to 1130 CE, the political and ceremonial center of Chacoan civilization was governed by a single matrilineal dynasty. The finding was not isolated. Across the Atlantic, archaeogenomic research at sites spanning the European Neolithic has begun revealing hereditary patterns in elite burials far older than the historical record suggests. The assumption that hereditary leadership emerged only with the rise of literate states and empires is collapsing under the weight of molecular evidence. The theory is perhaps the most disturbing on this list for anyone who believes that leadership was originally earned rather than inherited. Because the genetic data suggests that in some societies the question of who leads was answered at conception. Your blood decided. Your lineage decided. The accident of your birth, an event over which you exercised zero control and contributed zero effort, determined whether you would spend your life giving orders or taking them. When did human beings first decide that some bloodlines were worth more than others? When did the accident of birth first become the basis for political authority? The DNA from Room 33 does not answer those questions fully, but it pushes the origin of dynasty deeper into prehistory than anyone had documented before. And the uncomfortable reality is that hereditary power, once established, has proven extraordinarily difficult to displace. Revolutions destroy individual dynasties. They have never destroyed the principle of dynasty itself. The pharaohs are gone. The concept of inherited authority is not. Number 5. The table that bound. In 2010, Leor Grossman and Natalie Monroe published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, describing what they argued was the earliest evidence of organized feasting in the archaeological record. The site was Hilazon Taktit, the same cave in the Galilee where the shaman burial had been found. This time, the discovery was not about a single grave. It was about what surrounded it. The remains of at least 71 Mediterranean tortoises had been processed, cooked, and consumed at the site as part of what appeared to be a funerary feast. The scale was deliberate. The preparation showed organization. Multiple individuals had participated over what was likely a multi-day event approximately 12,000 years ago. Someone fed a crowd, and in the Natufian world, feeding a crowd was not a neutral act. The fifth theory of early human leadership selection centers on competitive feasting. The deliberate use of food as a political instrument. The host demonstrates surplus. The host demonstrates organizational capacity. The host demonstrates generosity on a scale that cannot be reciprocated by any single individual. And every person who eats at that table walks away carrying an invisible obligation they did not ask for and cannot easily repay. This is related to the big man theory but is more specific in its mechanism. Competitive feasting does not require ongoing generosity. It requires a single, overwhelming event. One feast large enough to place an entire community in social debt simultaneously. The calculations involved are not crude. They require understanding how much food creates gratitude, how much creates obligation, and how much creates resentment. Getting the balance wrong could backfire catastrophically. At Göbekli Tepe, the chemical residue analysis by Oliver Dietrich and colleagues, published in 2012, identified probable beer production alongside evidence of mass food processing. The builders of humanity's oldest monumental architecture may have been organized, fed, and motivated through competitive feasting on a scale never before seen. Beer and communal meals may have been the social technology that made cooperative construction possible. The theory implies that some of the earliest durable leaders were not warriors or shamans or elders, they were hosts. People who understood that sharing a meal creates a bond more powerful than any threat, any promise, or any appeal to tradition. The feast was the first political rally. The table was the first campaign podium. And the person who could fill it in a world of scarcity and hunger could ask nearly anything of those who ate from it. Every fundraising dinner, every state banquet, every corporate retreat with a catered menu. These are direct descendants of a Natufian gathering in a cave in northern Israel 12,000 years ago. The venue has changed. The mechanism has not changed at all. Number 4. The flint surgeon. In the limestone caves of Denisova in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, archaeologists recovered bone needles dating back approximately 50,000 years. The needles were small, precise, and functional. They had been used to sew fitted clothing from animal hides, garments that reduced heat loss by an estimated 80%, and allowed humans to survive in environments where unprotected exposure meant death within hours. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, Christopher Henshelwood of the University of Bergen recovered bifacial stone points dating to approximately 75,000 years ago that showed evidence of pressure flaking, a tool-making technique requiring extensive training and fine motor control that exceeds what most modern humans could achieve without instruction. Dietrich Stout at Emory University used neuroimaging technology across multiple studies published in Nature and PLOS One to demonstrate that the production of advanced stone tools, particularly late Acheulean hand axes and Levallois cores, activates brain regions associated with language processing, hierarchical planning, and abstract reasoning. Making a sophisticated stone tool was not manual labor. It was a cognitive performance that overlapped with the neural architecture of speech. The fourth theory of early human leadership selection centers on the toolmaker. In a band of 25 to 30 individuals surviving at the edge of the possible, the person who could produce a blade sharp enough to butcher a carcass efficiently, a scraper strong enough to process a hide for warmth, a projectile point accurate enough to bring down game at 40 meters, was not merely useful, they were essential. And essential people are difficult to overrule. Ethnographic evidence from Australian Aboriginal societies, documented by Peter Hiscock at the University of Sydney, shows that master toolmakers held social positions overlapping with those of senior men and ritual specialists. The ability to produce superior tools was not viewed as a trade skill. It was regarded as evidence of deeper knowledge, patience, discipline, and connection to ancestral practices that transcended mere craftsmanship. The theory suggests that long before there were kings, priests, or war chiefs, there was a simpler, more fundamental form of authority. The person who could make the thing that everyone else needed. The first specialist. The first individual whose expertise was so valuable, so difficult to replace, that the group organized itself in part around keeping that person alive, productive, and willing to share what they knew. A modern software engineer, a heart surgeon, a rocket propulsion specialist, each of them occupies a social position that traces its structural logic back to a Paleolithic toolmaker sitting at the edge of a fire, flaking obsidian with a precision that no one else in the group could replicate. The specific knowledge changes. The leverage that irreplaceable knowledge provides has remained constant for 75,000 years. Number 3. The circle without a center. In 2012, researchers at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, including Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis, published a series of evolutionary models examining how collective decision-making might have functioned in early human groups without any formal leadership structure. Their work drew on decades of game theory, evolutionary biology, and ethnographic data from surviving hunter-gatherer populations. The conclusion was counterintuitive. In many simulated and observed scenarios, groups without designated leaders made better decisions than groups with them. The third theory of early human leadership selection is that, for much of deep prehistory, there was no selection at all. Decisions were not delegated to an individual. They emerged from collective deliberation. Prolonged discussion, sometimes lasting days, in which every adult member of the group contributed until consensus was reached. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, studied extensively by Frank Marlowe of Cambridge University, major group decisions about when to relocate, where to hunt, and how to respond to external threats were discussed communally until every participant either agreed or at least declined to object. No single individual possessed the authority to override the group, no vote was taken, no majority could compel a minority. The process continued until alignment was reached, or the group fractured, and some members departed. Among the Mbuti of the Congolese Ituri forest, documented by Colin Turnbull in the 1960s, dispute resolution followed a similar communal pattern. Conflicts were aired publicly, often with theatrical displays of anger and humor, until the community arrived at a resolution that all parties could accept. The emphasis was not on determining who was right. It was on restoring the social cohesion that the conflict had disrupted. The theory suggests something radical about the natural shape of human political organization. For the vast majority of human existence, the default structure was not a pyramid. It was a circle. Every face visible to every other face. Every voice given weight. Every dissenter given the opportunity to speak until they were either persuaded or the group had persuaded itself. Yet the theory also explains its own collapse. Consensus works in groups of 30. It does not scale to groups of 300. It does not function when decisions must be made in minutes rather than days. It does not survive the arrival of external threats that demand immediate, unified action, without the luxury of prolonged deliberation. The moment human groups grew too large for every face to be visible, the circle broke, and what replaced it was never another circle, it was a pyramid. It has been a pyramid ever since. And every democratic institution in the modern world is, in some fundamental sense, an attempt to reconstruct a circle inside a structure that was designed to make circles impossible. Number 2. The chosen stranger. Approximately 30,000 years ago, obsidian blades found at Upper Paleolithic sites in Central Europe were chemically traced to volcanic sources in modern Hungary, over 800 kilometers from where they were deposited. Seashells from the Mediterranean appeared in burial sites in the Dordogne region of France, 500 kilometers from the nearest coast. Amber from the Baltic reached central Germany. These objects did not walk. Someone carried them. Someone negotiated their exchange. Someone moved between groups that were separated by hundreds of kilometers of frozen steppe, dense forest, and mountain ranges, and was welcomed at both ends. Clive Gamble at the University of Southampton published extensively through the 2000s and 2010s on the social landscape of Paleolithic Europe. His research demonstrated that Upper Paleolithic communities maintained relationships with distant groups through systems of reciprocal exchange. Materials moved along these networks. But so did something far more valuable: information. Knowledge of herd movements. Warnings about environmental shifts. Awareness of resource availability in territories the local group had never visited. The second theory of early human leadership selection proposes that in some prehistoric communities, particularly those positioned along ecological boundaries, trade routes, or migration corridors, the most valued leader was not a member of the group at all. The most valued leader was an outsider. The individual who had traveled, who had been elsewhere, who had seen how other groups lived, what tools they used, what dangers they had encountered. The person who could describe conditions beyond the horizon, who could translate between groups that spoke different dialects, who could mediate disputes that no insider could touch because every insider carried local loyalties and local grudges. The chosen stranger occupied a paradoxical position. They belonged fully to no group yet were valuable to every group they visited. Their authority came not from deep roots in one community, but from broad reach across many. Not from knowing one place well, but from knowing many places partially. Research by Robin Torrance at the Australian Museum documented how long-distance traders in Melanesian and Pacific Island societies held social positions of significant influence, often bridging secular and sacred authority. They were trusted precisely because they had no local debts, no inherited feuds, no factional loyalties. They could see the dispute from outside. And outside perspective, in a world where inside perspective was the only kind most people ever had, was extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable. Yet the theory carries a shadow that stretches forward through all of human history, because the stranger who is invited in can also be the stranger who takes over. The line between a welcomed mediator and an occupying force has been crossed more times than any historian can count. And it was crossed first, not in the age of empires or colonial ships, but in the age of obsidian blades carried across frozen rivers by people whose names the receiving group had never heard before. Number 1. The Grain Throne. Approximately 500 years ago, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains in what is now western Iran, a group of humans did something that would dismantle the political structure their species had maintained for 290,000 years. They planted seeds deliberately, they waited for the grain to grow, they harvested it, and they stored it. This is not a story about agriculture. This is a story about the birth of permanent, unchallengeable power. Because the moment grain could be stored, the question of who controlled the grain became the most important political question in human existence. More important than who was the best hunter. More important than who told the best stories. More important than who could speak to the dead, organize a feast, or mediate a dispute between neighbors. The person who controlled whether the grain was distributed or withheld, controlled whether people ate or starved. And the person who controls starvation does not need charisma, spiritual authority, or physical strength. They already possess the only leverage that matters. James C. Scott at Yale University published his argument in 2017 in a book titled Against the Grain. His thesis was stark. The earliest states were not built on consent, shared culture, or collective identity. They were built on the ability to control a storable, countable, taxable food supply. Grain, specifically wheat, barley, rice, and millet, was unique among all food sources in that it ripened at a predictable time, could be harvested in bulk, could be measured precisely, could be stored for months or years without total loss, and could be seized by anyone with enough manpower to guard a building. No other food source provided all of these characteristics simultaneously. You cannot tax a wild berry, you cannot store a mammoth kill for 2 years, you cannot inventory a forest of edible roots, but you can count sacks of grain. You can lock a granary door, you can post guards, and you can decide, every single day, who eats and who does not. Archaeological evidence from early Neolithic settlements across the Fertile Crescent supports this interpretation. At Kayonu in southeastern Turkey, dating to approximately 8,500 to 7,000 BCE, researchers found large communal storage facilities alongside increasingly differentiated residential architecture. Some houses were larger, better constructed, and filled with more elaborate goods than others. Social hierarchy was emerging. And it was emerging in direct, measurable correlation with the ability to accumulate and control surplus grain. For 290,000 years, every leadership structure described on this list had a built-in expiration mechanism. The reverse dominance hierarchy kept ambition in check. The consensus circle gave everyone a voice. The big man could be displaced by a more generous rival. The shaman could be doubted. The war chief stepped down when the fighting stopped. The elder eventually died, and the next elder took their place. Then someone built a granary, and every mechanism failed. The person who controlled stored grain did not need the group's permission to lead. They did not need the group's affection. They did not need to be wise, or brave, or generous, or spiritually gifted. They needed only the grain, and the walls to protect it, and the armed men to guard those walls, and the willingness to let people go hungry until they agreed to do what they were told. Every empire that has ever existed, from Sumer to Egypt to Rome to the colonial plantations of the modern era, traces its foundational logic to this single innovation. Not agriculture itself, but the realization that food, when stored in sufficient quantities, is not nutrition. It is power. And once that realization entered the human mind, it never left. The 15 theories on this list span approximately 300,000 years of human political evolution. From coalitions that crushed aspiring tyrants to shamans who spoke to the dead. From generous men who trapped their communities in webs of debt to matrilineal dynasties whose authority flowed through the mother's blood. From war chiefs who rose during violence and fell during peace to elders whose memories were the only libraries that existed. From ritual directors who built monuments to gods no one today can name, to storytellers whose version of events was the only version anyone would ever hear. From circles where every voice mattered to granaries where only one voice mattered at all. The story of how humans chose their leaders is not a story of progress. It is a story of mechanisms invented, tested, exploited, and replaced. And the replacements were not always improvements. Some were catastrophically worse. The grain controller who starves dissidents into obedience is not a better leader than the elder who remembers where the water is. He is simply a more durable one. Every system of government that exists today is a descendant of decisions made by people who left no written record, people whose names we will never know, people who stood around a fire in a world we would not recognize and answered a question that we are still answering now. Who decides? The truly unsettling part is not that the question is old, it is that after 300,000 years, we still have not found a good answer. And the people who came closest, the ones who built the reverse dominance hierarchy, the ones who insisted that no one should hold power over anyone else, were the first ones swept aside when the grain began to accumulate. If you want to see more videos like this one, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.